I can't lose my hands. It hurts. The shattered waitress sobbed as she stumbled through the heavy mahogany doors of the Iron Lotus Lounge at 2:14 in the morning. 24 years old, but her spirit looked worn to a thread. Strands of sweat-soaked hair clung to her ghostly pale face. Her eyes, once bright, were now hollow pits of exhaustion. She moved like a broken doll, her arms held out stiffly as if the slightest movement brought a scream to her throat. Her faded yellow apron was stained with industrial lye, and the dirty bandages around her hands were beginning to seep a terrifying crimson. The scent of expensive cigars, the clinking of ice in crystal glasses, and the presence of 5 men in suits that cost more than her father's life debt went absolutely silent when she crumpled against the velvet chair and breathed the words that froze the room. The fire! It won't stop. I can't even close my fingers anymore. Please. Her voice was a dying ember, but the chemical burns creeping up her wrists told the story of Mr. Kang's cruelty loud enough. And what the most disciplined mafia boss in Seoul did next made the entire city weep. Alindro, no, Diho, the architect, Park, set his crystal glass down with the terrifying precision of a man who was about to dismantle a world. The silence in the Iron Lotus Lounge was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the unspoken fury of the man at the head of the table. Diho, the architect, Park did not move, yet the air around him seemed to chill. He looked down at the silver watch on his wrist, now marred by a smear of Minna's blood, then back to the crumpled, trembling girl cradled against the velvet upholstery. Her hands, partially exposed by the unraveling, chemical-stained bandages, looked less like human limbs and more like a map of a war zone. "Jinsu," Diho whispered. The low frequency of his voice was more commanding than a shout. His enforcer was already there, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. "Sir." "Call Dr. Han. Tell him he has 10 minutes to prep the surgical suite at the estate. If he isn't ready when we arrive, he can consider his medical license as dead as his future." At the far end of the table, a man named Choi, a high-ranking associate with a face like a hatchet, cleared his throat. "Diho, with all respect, look at her. She's a waitress from a gutter diner. She's covered in lie and debt. Bringing a girl like this into the inner sanctum, it's a liability. We have a shipment arriving at the docks in 2 hours. We don't have time for a stray." Diho finally looked up. His resting stone face didn't break, but his eyes narrowed. "A liability, Choi." "She's nothing," Choi pressed, sensing he had the room's logic on his side. "She's a broken tool. Let Jinsu drop her at a public clinic and be done with it." Diho stood up slowly, the silk of his suit whispering against the chair. He walked toward Choi, the light catching the dragon tattoo peeking from his collar. "Tools are replaceable, Choi. People who work until their bones scream and their skin peels away, those people are the foundation of everything you enjoy. My grandmother died with hands that looked exactly like these because men like you thought she was a liability." The room went deathly still. Diho leaned over the table, his voice dropping an octave. "Save her hands, every nerve, every tendon. I want them restored as if the fire never touched them. If the cost is a shipment, let it sink. If the cost is your approval, I'll take that too." He turned back to Minna, who was drifting into a shock-induced unconsciousness. He reached down and, with surprising tenderness, tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Jinsu, clear the roads," Diho commanded. "The architect has issued a decree. She doesn't lose a single finger. Not tonight, not ever." The smell of antiseptic and the rhythmic hum of a heart monitor had replaced the stale grease of the diner, but Minna still looked trapped in a nightmare. She lay in the center of a sterile, private hospital wing, her hands suspended and cocooned in thick, white dressings that looked like heavy clubs. Diho stood by the window, a silhouette of sharp lines against the rising dawn, his gaze fixed on the girl whose life he had claimed as his responsibility. The heavy door creaked open, and a small, hunched figure shuffled in. It was Halmoni, her colorful floral visor pulled low over a face etched with 1,000 lines of sorrow. She didn't look at the luxury of the room or the dangerous man standing by the glass. She went straight to Minna's bedside, her breath hitching in a sob that seemed to crack the silence of the room. "My poor child," Halmoni whispered, reaching out to touch the girl's forehead with a trembling hand. "I told her to run. I told her the debt wasn't worth her soul. Diho turned, his presence filling the room like a cold front. Who did this to her? His voice was a low, dangerous vibration. The doctors say it isn't just a burn, it's deep, corrosive. Halmoni looked up, her eyes watery and fierce. It's Mr. Kang's discipline. He calls it the chemical handshake. Whenever a girl complains about the hours or asks for her wages, he makes her scrub the industrial grease traps in the basement. But he takes away the gloves first. He tells them if they want to eat, they have to work, and if they want to work, they have to be clean. Diho's jaw tightened, the only sign of the storm brewing beneath his skin. Go on. Minna, she was the only one who stood up for the younger ones, Halmoni continued, her voice shaking. 2 days ago, she caught him trying to trap a new girl in the walk-in freezer. She fought him. So he locked her in that basement for 12 hours with a bucket of undiluted lye and a steel brush. He told her if the floor wasn't shining like a mirror by morning, he'd break her sister's fingers too. She scrubbed until she couldn't feel her skin anymore. She scrubbed until she hit the bone. The architect felt a phantom pain in his own hands, a memory of his grandmother's weeping sores. The order he craved had been violated by a man who treated human life like disposable rags. Halmoni, Diho said, his tone suddenly terrifyingly calm. Go home, pack your things, you won't be going back to that diner. But Mr. Kang, he says we owe. Mr. Kang no longer owns the air he breathes, Diho interrupted, his silver watch gleaming as he adjusted his cuff. He made the mistake of thinking these hands were meant for work. I'm going to show him they were meant for justice. The neon sign for the midnight diner flickered with a dying buzz, casting a sickly yellow light over the cracked pavement of the alley. Inside, Mr. Kang sat at a grease-slicked booth, counting a wad of crumpled bills with a cigarette dangling from his lip. He was laughing, a wet, guttural sound. Recounting to one of his thugs how the little glass waitress had probably crawled into a gutter to die. He didn't hear the front door open. He didn't notice the sudden, unnatural silence that swallowed the hum of the refrigerators. It was only when the shadow fell across his table, a long, sharp-edged darkness, that Kang looked up. Standing there was Jinsu. He was a pillar of midnight in a room of filth, his all-black tactical gear polished to a dull, lethal sheen. He didn't look like a man, he looked like an omen. We're closed, pal, Kang spat, though his hand instinctively moved toward the heavy brass ring on his pinky. Get out before I... Jinsu didn't let him finish. In a movement so fast it seemed to blur the air, his gloved hand shot out, seizing Kang's wrist and slamming it flat against the table. The cigarette fell from Kang's mouth as he let out a strangled yelp. The architect has completed his audit of your establishment, Jinsu said, his voice as cold and flat as a tombstone. The architect, I don't know any. You don't need to know him, Jinsu interrupted, increasing the pressure until the wood of the table groaned. You only need to know that you've been found in significant debt. You stole the health of a girl whose value you couldn't possibly calculate, and in my world, we collect our debts in kind. With his free hand, Jinsu produced a small, glass vial of the same industrial lye Kang had used on Minna. He set it on the table with a terrifyingly gentle click. Kang's face went from sweaty red to a translucent, sickly gray. What are you doing? I have friends on the council, I have. You have nothing, Jinsu whispered, leaning in close so Kang could see his own terrified reflection in the enforcer's dark eyes. As of 3 minutes ago, your friends have been paid to forget your name. Your diner has been seized, and now we're going to discuss the interest on those hands you broke. Jinsu didn't strike him. He didn't need to. He simply leaned on the vial, the glass hairline fracturing under his thumb. This is the first strike, Kang. Every finger she can't move is a building of yours I burn. Every scar on her skin is a year of your life I take. Tonight, you aren't a boss, you're a warning. As Jinsu turned to leave, he paused at the door, tossing a single, blackened yellow apron onto the floor. Clean it up, he commanded. And use your bare hands. The architect wants to see if you're as resilient as she was. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Russo estate, casting long, golden bars across the private therapy suite. Minna sat perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands no longer shrouded in bulky bandages, but fitted with specialized compression sleeves. Her fingers, once raw and mangled, were now a pale web of healing skin and delicate sutures. She stared at them with a mixture of hope and profound fear, her breath hitching as she tried to make her thumb touch her index finger. It wouldn't move. Slowly, a voice rumbled. Deho stood beside her, having shed his suit jacket for a simple black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He didn't look like a monster today, he looked like an anchor. "It's stuck," Minna whispered, her eyes brimming with frustrated tears. "If I can't even hold a tray, Deho, if I can't scrub or carry, then what am I? I'm just a burden. I'm just taking up space in your house." Deho pulled a small wooden stool in front of her and sat, placing his large, steady hands palm up on his knees. "Is that what you think you are? A set of tools that happen to break?" "I've always been a worker," she said, her voice trembling. "My father's debt, Mr. Kang's kitchen. My hands were all I had to offer the world. Without them, I'm nothing." Deho reached out, but he didn't grab her. He gently slid his hand beneath hers, supporting her wrist without forcing the movement. "Look at me, Minna." When she finally met his gaze, she found not the cold architect, but a man whose eyes held an ancient, weary understanding. A piano is not less valuable because its strings are muted. A painting is not trash because the canvas is torn. You have spent your whole life being used as an instrument for other people's greed. You think your value is in what you can do for them. He took a small, soft rubber ball and placed it in her palm, his fingers grazing hers with a warmth that made her heart race. "Try again. Not for the diner. Not for the debt. Do it because you deserve to feel the world again." With a ragged sob, Minna squeezed. It was a tiny, microscopic movement, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, someone was looking at her and seeing a person instead of a pair of hands. As Deho's thumb traced a gentle, encouraging circle over her wrist, the crushing weight of her uselessness began to lift. In the silence of the room, she realized that while the doctors had sewn her skin back together, it was this man who was starting to piece together her soul. The walls were closing in on Mr. Kang, and he could smell the rot of his own empire. In less than 48 hours, his bank accounts had been frozen, his diner had been shuttered by health inspectors who refused his bribes, and the shadowy allies who once laughed at his cruel jokes now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a drowning man, and in his twisted mind, there was only one life jacket left, the girl who had started it all. The recovery wing of the Russo Estates private clinic was bathed in the soft, blue light of midnight. Minna was asleep, her hands resting on silk pillows, her breathing finally rhythmic and deep. She didn't hear the soft click of the door or the heavy, uneven footsteps of a man who had traded his sanity for a desperate gamble. Kang stood over her bed, his Hawaiian shirt stained with sweat and tobacco. He looked down at her healing hands and felt a surge of loathing. "You think you're a queen now?" he hissed, his voice a jagged rasp. He pulled a heavy, rusted pair of handcuffs from his waistband. "You're still just a debt to be collected." He reached out to grab her shoulder, intending to drag her from the bed before the high-tech security could blink, but his hand never made contact. A cold, metallic click echoed through the room, the sound of a hammer cocking back on a semi-automatic pistol. "I wouldn't," a voice whispered from the corner of the room. Kang froze, his blood turning to ice. Deho stepped out from the shadows, his silk shirt pristine, his expression as unreadable as a tombstone. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been waiting. Behind him, Jinsu appeared like a ghost in the doorway, blocking the only exit. You stole my life," Kang bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "She belongs to me, she owes me." "She owes nothing but the air she breathes, which you are currently wasting," Deho said, stepping closer. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer gravity of his presence seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. "You walked into the one place on Earth where you are least welcome, Kang. You thought leverage was a person. You were wrong. Leverage is the fact that I haven't killed you yet." Minna stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She saw the monster from her nightmares standing over her, but then she saw the man of stone standing between them. For the first time, she didn't scream. She didn't even tremble. She looked at Deho and saw a promise kept. "Jinsu," Deho said, never taking his eyes off Kang. "Take him to the basement, not ours, his. I want him to see exactly what remains of his kingdom before it vanishes forever." As Jinsu dragged the sobbing, thrashing man away, Diho sat on the edge of Minna's bed. He reached out and with the same hand that held the power of life and death, gently adjusted her blanket. "Go back to sleep, Minna," he whispered. "The predator is gone. Only the architect remains." The basement of the Midnight Diner was a place of ghosts and chemical stenches, but tonight, the power dynamic had shifted. Mr. Kang was no longer the king of this damp, concrete hell. He was a man zip-tied to a rusted metal chair, the very chair where he had sat while watching Minna scrub the floors until her skin wept. The single overhead bulb swung lazily, casting rhythmic shadows across the architect. Face as Diho stood before him, peeling off his silk suit jacket and handing it to Jinsu. "You like to talk about debt, Kang," Diho said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. "You like to talk about what people owe you, but you forgot to calculate the interest on a human soul." Kang's face was a mess of tears and snot. "Please, Boss Park, it was just a girl. I'll pay for the doctors, I'll give you the diner, just don't do this." Diho ignored the plea. He walked over to a workbench and picked up a heavy, steel-toothed brush, the same kind Minna had been forced to use. He ran his thumb over the bristles, the sound like a serrated whisper in the silence. She said it felt like fire. She said she couldn't close her hands because the pain was so loud it drowned out the world. Do you know what the most beautiful part of the human hand is, Kang? The complexity. The way 27 bones work in perfect harmony to create, to touch, to hold. Diho stepped into the light, his shadow swallowing the villain. "You broke that harmony. You turned a creator into a cripple for the sake of a clean floor." Diho didn't use a gun. He didn't use a knife. He leaned down and placed his large, powerful hands over Kang's pinned wrists. He didn't squeeze yet. He simply let the weight of his judgment rest there. "I am a man of order, and order dictates that for every nerve you scorched in her, I must take one of yours. For every bone you bruised, I must ensure yours never set quite right again." The screams that followed were muffled by the heavy soundproofing of the basement, a rhythmic, sickening crunch of bone meeting calculated pressure. Diho worked with the precision of a surgeon, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. He wasn't acting out of blind rage, he was balancing a ledger. When he finally stood back, Kang's hands hung limp and shattered, not enough to kill him, but enough to ensure he could never hold a cigarette, a wad of cash, or a weapon ever again. "You're alive, Kang," Diho whispered, wiping a stray drop of sweat from his forehead with a pristine handkerchief. "But you're finished. From this moment on, you will be the one who cannot work. You will be the one who feels the fire. And every time you look at your hands, you will remember her name." Diho turned away, leaving the broken man in the dark. The chemical handshake had been returned in full, and for the first time in the history of that basement, the air felt clean. The heavy, iron-bound ledgers of the Iron Lotus Syndicate lay closed on Diho's desk, but today they were not the focus of his attention. Minna stood in the center of the sun-drenched office, her hands no longer hidden in bandages or compression sleeves. They were bare, the skin smooth and healthy, save for the faint, silver-threaded scars that spoke of a war she had finally won. She watched as Diho opened a lacquered wooden box, his movements deliberate and calm. He pulled out a thick stack of yellowed, tea-stained papers, the promissory notes signed in her father's desperate, shaky hand nearly a decade ago. These were the chains that had anchored Minna to the basement of the Midnight Diner, the weight that had allowed Mr. Kang to treat her like a piece of equipment. Without a word, Diho gripped the stack. With a single, decisive motion, he tore the papers down the center. The sound of rending parchment filled the room like a long-overdue exhale. He tore them again, and again, until the debt that had defined her entire adult life was nothing more than a handful of white confetti. "It's gone," Diho said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Your father's mistakes no longer belong to you. You are a woman with no past to pay for." Minna reached out, her fingers brushing the shredded remains on the desk. She didn't cry out. She simply let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she was an orphan of 14. But Diho wasn't finished. He reached back into the box and pulled out a single, crisp envelope embossed with a gold seal. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward her. "What is this?" she whispered, her newly healed fingers trembling only slightly as she opened it. Inside was a legal deed and a set of silver keys. "The Midnight Diner is being demolished," Deho explained, his eyes fixed on hers. "In its place and in your name stands a new establishment. It's a cafe on the corner of the park where the sun hits the windows first thing in the morning. No industrial lie, no grease traps, just light." Minna looked at the deed, seeing her own name printed in bold, undeniable ink. She wasn't a waitress anymore, she was an owner. She wasn't a victim, she was a success. "I can't possibly pay you back for this," she choked out, her vision blurring with tears of pure relief. Deho stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. He didn't reach for her hands as a master, but as a man. "You already paid, Minna. You paid with every day you refused to let them break your spirit. This isn't a gift, it's a restoration." For the first time, Minna didn't pull away. She took the keys, the cool metal pressing against her palm, and realized that for the first time in her life, her hands were finally her own. The scent of yeast and roasting coffee beans drifted through the open doors of the new cafe, a fragrant contrast to the chemical ghosts of Minna's past. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the polished wood and the rows of delicate pastries that lined the counter. Above the entrance, a simple, elegant sign hung, the Golden Lotus. Halmoni stood behind the espresso machine, her colorful ajama visor replaced by a crisp, white linen apron. She was humming a folk song, her movements light despite her age. Every few minutes, she would pause to adjust a vase of fresh lilies or wipe a speck of dust that didn't exist, her eyes crinkling into deep folds of joy. When she looked at Minna, she didn't see the glass waitress who had collapsed in a pool of tears. She saw a woman who stood tall, her presence commanding the room with a quiet, newfound grace. Minna moved through the space with the confidence of someone who finally owned the ground beneath her feet. She wore a dress the color of a soft sunrise, her sleeves rolled back to reveal the faint silver lines on her wrists, scars that no longer felt like shackles, but like medals of honor. As she reached out to hand a customer their order, her fingers were steady. There was no pain, no trembling, and no fear. "You're doing it, Minna," Halmoni whispered, leaning over the counter as the morning rush began to taper off. "You've turned the fire into light." Minna looked around the bustling room, at the families laughing over brunch and the students tucked into quiet corners. For a decade, she had been a shadow in a basement, a tool to be used until it snapped. Now she was the heart of a community. She looked at her hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors and endured lie, and saw them beautifully dusted with flour and sugar. A familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb outside, and Minna's heart gave a soft, rhythmic thrum. She didn't need to look at the driver to know who it was. She looked at Halmoni, who gave her a knowing, tearful smile, the kind of smile a grandmother gives when she knows the child she protected is finally, truly safe. "Go," Halmoni urged, waving a flower-covered hand toward the door. "I can handle the counter for a moment. Someone is waiting to see the owner." Minna wiped her hands on her apron and stepped toward the sunlight, the glass waitress finally shattered and replaced by someone unbreakable. She was no longer just surviving, she was blooming. The chime above the door of the Golden Lotus rang with a soft, melodic clarity, signaling the final visitor of the day. The afternoon rush had faded into a peaceful amber glow, and the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and the quiet satisfaction of a dream realized. Minna was wiping down the last of the mahogany tables, her movements fluid and rhythmic, when she looked up. Deho stood in the doorway. For the first time since she had known him, he wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His sleeves were rolled up, his silk tie loosened, and the sharp, impenetrable edges of the architect seemed to have softened under the warm soul sunset. He didn't look like a man who commanded an underworld empire. He looked like a man who had finally found a place where he could breathe. He walked toward the counter, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't scan the room for threats or check his silver watch with the precision of a strategist. He simply watched her, the way she moved without flinching, the way her shoulders had lost their permanent hunch of fear, and the way the light caught the silver scars on her wrists, making them shine like fine jewelry. "The coffee smells better than anything in the Iron Lotus," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble that no longer made her freeze, but instead made her heart feel full. Minna smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "That's because it's made with hands that are happy to work, Diho." She stepped out from behind the counter and met him in the center of the room. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of the lounge where they first met. It was a comfortable, shared peace. Diho reached out, hesitantly at first, as if afraid he might still find the broken girl from the diner. But then he took her hand in his. His palm was large and warm, his grip steady and protective. Minna didn't pull away. She interlaced her fingers with his, the skin-to-skin contact a silent testament to her healing. For the first time, she felt the strength in her own grip, the result of months of therapy and a lifetime of resilience. "I spent my life building things of steel and stone," Diho whispered, looking down at their joined hands. "I thought order was something you forced upon the world, but you taught me that the only order that matters is the one that protects a heart like yours." He looked into her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the Mafia boss vanished entirely. "I promised you'd never feel that pain again. I intend to keep that promise for the rest of my life." Minna squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing the line of his knuckles. She realized then that the everyone who cried at the end of this story wasn't just the people watching from the outside. It was the two of them, shedding the last of their old selves. She wasn't just his rescue, and he wasn't just her savior. They were two souls, once broken, now holding on to the only thing that was truly unbreakable.